Tilde. No, the German government is not going to start drugging its citizens with oxytocin in order to force them to accept more immigrants into their country. Now let's have a little look-see at why exactly I would have to make such an obvious statement. Not all that long ago, the internet was abuzz with stories such as this. German scientists drug public with oxytocin to promote the acceptance and integration of migrants. Scientists claim people will love refugees once they are dosed with oxytocin, the hormone produced by babies to make their mothers love them, and various other stories along those lines. Some of the articles would go even so far as to start sowing the seeds of suggestion by questioning whether or not people would think that oxytocin would suddenly begin to show up in the local water supply. Indeed, this sentiment of the German government just mass drugging its population through the water is a sentiment that seems to show up repeatedly throughout several of the comment sections of these articles. It was also alluded to in a message that someone sent me on YouTube asking me to talk about this particular topic. It read, "Do a video on how Germany is going to start to drug its population with oxytocin." So this idea that the German government is just going to start forcing its citizenry to ingest oxytocin somehow seems to be alive and well. So we'll take a little look at the relevant parts of the study that caused all of this fear-mongering to start to spread, and then we'll address the actual concept of drugging your populace through the drinking water with oxytocin and why it simply would not work. The study in question is this one. Oxytocin-enforced norm compliance reduces xenophobic out-group rejection. This was published back in August 2017. The study itself was quite simple. 3 rounds of experimentation, all built on one simple task. Each person is given €50 and then shown 50 pictures of either native Germans or migrants, 25 of each, with a short story about how poor and needy that person is. And then the person with the €50 can decide to either give them €1 or not give them €1. Any remaining money would be considered a personal payoff. The differences between the 3 studies were looking at oxytocin versus placebo, and social norms versus non-social norm. Study 1 was done using both men and women, and they were all assembled in one hall together, which gave you the positive norm because then you can see what everyone else is donating. So that would prompt you to maybe give more. The donations given to refugees in that circumstance were 19% higher than that given to the natives. That was Experiment 1. Experiments 2 and 3 were done with a different sampling, 107 men, and this is where the oxytocin and placebo come in, as well as measuring the participants' levels of xenophobia. Somewhat unsurprisingly, when you looked at the effects of oxytocin alone, which is figure C here, the administration of oxytocin increased the amount of money given in the low xenophobia group to everyone, and in the group which displayed higher levels of xenophobia, it really did nothing. In this experiment, it should be noted that each of the people are alone in a room when they're giving out the money on this particular version of the test. So there's no risk of any sort of social shaming or social prompting or anything like that. The final experiment was done similar to Experiment 2, except that when the test subjects were shown the vignette, they were also given the amount of money that other people had donated to that person. And that was considered to be the social prompt to give a little bit more. As you can see in Figure D, the people given the placebo versus the placebo plus that little bit of prompting, the prompt had a little bit of an impact in the low xenophobia group, but in the high xenophobia group it did basically nothing. When comparing oxytocin to oxytocin plus the norm, for people in the low xenophobia group it did actually nothing, but it did increase the generosity for people higher in xenophobia. Ultimately, these findings really shouldn't be very surprising. We know that social prompting is a way of getting people to do things, and we know that oxytocin increases people's ability to form bonds with others. We'll go a little bit more into that shortly. For now, I just want to look at what made this particular paper so controversial. Given the fact that there have been other studies done on oxytocin and in-group, out-group preferences and dynamics, such as this one, Oxytocin Modulates the Racial Bias in Neural Responses to Others' Suffering, published in Biological Psychology back in 2012, this one took groups of Asian males and showed them an Asian face, both in a neutral position and a position displaying pain, and a Caucasian face doing the same. When the neural responses were measured using an EEG machine, it was found that oxytocin increased the empathy concern in the in-group, which would be towards the Asian face, but did very little for the out-group face. In fact, similar to the example with the refugees from the first paper, it actually very slightly decreased it, but not really to a point where it's statistically relevant. So it's pretty consistently found that oxytocin, whenever it's administered, will improve bonding in the in-group. Oxytocin promoting bonds in the out-groups depends a lot more upon that person's position to start with. So in Germany, where people were more altruistic and more likely to give to refugees as a baseline anyway, oxytocin did increase the giving to refugees for the people low in xenophobia. You'll remember, for the people high in xenophobia, it didn't really do anything. And that actually somewhat backs up the Chinese study, China being a far more socially and politically insular country compared to Germany. And that's a very important thing to consider. The degree of social control and social influence you have over the people who are being administered the oxytocin. So we've got another study here, the herding hormone oxytocin stimulates in-group conformity. This one from 2012 again, and also helps to highlight that you give people oxytocin, their in-group preference rises. Now what I want you to do is to keep that in mind, especially in light of the need for the social prompting that the first study gave. Because when you consider it in the light of this study from 2011, oxytocin promotes human ethnocentrism. And this one from 2014, oxytocin increases liking for a country's people and national flag, but not for other cultural symbols or consumer products. Now these two studies are telling us things that we already knew. Oxytocin promotes in-group preference. And these last two studies about the ethnocentrism and the patriotism, essentially, this is one of the reasons why a mass distribution of oxytocin to your populace simply would not work when it came to making them accept migrants into their communities. Because if there are no migrants in their communities for them to have to bond with, then all you'd succeed in doing would be making them more of an insular population, and actually then ultimately less likely to accept migrants into their community. Because their baseline of in-group preference would be higher because you've been dosing them with oxytocin. So in fact, if you blanket gave this to everyone, you'd succeed in doing the exact opposite of making your populace more pliant to accepting immigrants. When considered in the light of all of these other studies, this latest German study doesn't suggest that you can just nuke your populace with oxytocin and they suddenly become the most chill and accepting people ever. What it would actually seem to indicate is that social pressure alongside oxytocin will give you that result. They form a feedback loop into each other. Both are necessary when it comes to dealing with populations who may already have high xenophobic tendencies. And of course, as the other studies have shown us, if you just gave people high in xenophobia a load of oxytocin, congratulations, you've just made them more xenophobic, because they would be lacking the social stimulus or the social stigma suggesting that they should do otherwise. Further to this, the idea that you could universally enforce some high social standard or some high level of social pressure into accepting migrants across an entire country is an absurdity. You simply could not do this on the peer-to-peer level that this study seems to suggest is necessary. Sure, you could take it to ridiculously high levels of state-issued propaganda. A television in every house playing nothing but the government's television channel. Everything else is banned. But even then, this sort of pressure would probably still be insufficient. Given that there is already a lot of government and indeed media pressure carrying positive messages of diversity, there has been over the past few years an ever-increasing polarization of politics. And part of that is a backlash to this propagandist level of reality distortion. When you also consider the works of Allport from the 1950s and his work on contact hypothesis, which at its most base level is just a very fancy academic way of saying, if you hang around a lot of people that you don't like and you experience positive interactions, eventually you'll stop not liking them. Because at that point you've humanized them, you've come to understand them, and thus there shouldn't be any sort of racism or prejudice or discrimination or stereotyping or anything like that. But to highlight again, the interactions must be positive. And I think that this, combined with some of the paper's language, specifically talking about Europe and the current European migration crisis, is what has made this so controversial. Because the main problem that's happening in Europe with regards to the increasing numbers of migrants is that a lot of the interactions are not positive. People are seeing once beautiful and functioning areas becoming shanty towns, areas that they used to frequent being deemed no-go zones by mail services and police. And so I think this paper then talking about Europe's need to accommodate the large influx of migrants, how latent xenophobia is a problem in Europe, and talking about how recent elections in Europe have favoured populist candidates who have openly expressed xenophobic attitudes towards refugees, makes what is ultimately a quite innocuous paper sound very accusatory towards Europeans, as if the entire reason for the problems that are being had with migrant communities is down to them, and them alone. I believe this situation may also have not been helped along by the fact that René Hullman, a professor at the university where this paper was published, has been quoted as saying, "Given the right circumstances, oxytocin may help promote the acceptance and integration of migrants into Western cultures." A statement which is completely true and in line with all of the research that we've been looking at. Circumstantially, oxytocin can increase bonding. With the correct amount of social nudging combined with oxytocin, you can potentially increase acceptance of migrants in some people who do identify as being higher in xenophobia. The statement is correct. It could, maybe, perhaps, in the correct circumstances. Not, as some people seem to be interpreting this sentence, yes it absolutely will and we need to be forcing oxytocin down people's throats and constantly slapping them around the face with messages of positive reinforcement. So to wind things down, let's turn our attention back to the people who seem to think that Germany is going to spread oxytocin through the water to try to force their populace to be more accommodating of migrants. We've looked at some of the research around oxytocin and in-group and out-group dynamics and how that really won't work, but now let's look at some of the chemical and medical reasons why it won't work. So the problem with trying to drug the drinking water with oxytocin to get this migrant acceptance result, first and foremost, is you have zero control over the dosing of oxytocin that any person would get. Some people may drink a lot of tap water, some people may drink exclusively bottled water, so it would be far too unreliable. Second to that, if you did start putting it in the water, which is highly unethical, it would probably be illegal. And then there's the slightly pesky little fact that oxytocin is destroyed in the gastrointestinal tract, so it can't be taken orally, because your stomach acid will destroy it. That's why in all of the studies that we've looked at in this video, the oxytocin was administered intranasally via a nasal spray, which allows it to cross the blood-brain barrier. And the other method, which is the preferred method of dosing people with oxytocin, is to inject it. This is why most of the literature on the subject will talk about dosing as part of an infusion. So when it comes to this entire saga, from the ground up, the initial research, other research papers, how the drug works, how the drug is administered, on every single level, this idea that the German government is just going to start somehow dosing people with oxytocin is complete bunk. It's not going to happen, and it's definitely not going to happen via the drinking water.